Welcome. You found your way here at the end of the day. This is your time to rest, a time for peace and for stillness. As you settle in, perhaps lying down, perhaps tucking the blankets around you just so, I invite you to breathe a little slower, to let your shoulders relax, and to know that there is nothing you need to do right now, except listen. I'm going to tell you a long and gentle story. The story of George Washington, not the loud, hurried version filled with battles and speeches, but a softer story. A story of his days, his routines, his home, his world. A story told so slowly that you may find your thoughts drifting like a leaf on a quiet river. And if you drift away to sleep before the story ends, that is perfectly fine. So let us begin. George Washington was born a long time ago in the year 1732. It was February, and though the winters in Virginia were not as harsh as those farther north, the air still carried a chill. He was born on a plantation near the banks of the Potomac River. Imagine the scene, the gentle smoke rising from a chimney, the quiet crackle of a hearth fire inside a wooden home, the sound of wind weaving through bare branches. George was the first child of Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. He would grow up in a large family with brothers and sisters, some from his father's earlier marriage. In those days, homes were often filled with many children, and the rhythm of family life was steady and constant. Each day would begin early. The sun rose, and with it came the work of tending to the land, caring for the animals, and managing the household. George, as a boy, would have watched and listened, learning quietly from his parents and older brothers. When we picture George Washington as a child, it's helpful to set aside the image of the stern general or the dignified president. Instead, imagine a young boy exploring fields and woods. In Virginia of the 1730s, the countryside was open and green. There were wide rivers and creeks to wade through, tall trees that whispered with the breeze, and soil that smelled rich and earthy after a rain. George grew up in this natural world. He learned to ride horses while still very young. Horses were not just for recreation, then they were an essential part of life, for travel, for work, for trade. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk steadily. Imagine the small boy perched carefully on a pony, the morning mist still clinging to the grass, his hands gripping the reins, his eyes bright, his heart steady, the quiet clop of hooves on packed earth, the rustle of birds starting their day. Life in the Washington household was not hurried, but it was full. There were always tasks to be done, and George would have helped with small chores, perhaps carrying water from the well, or gathering kindling, or watching over the younger children. And in the evenings, the family gathered together. Candlelight flickered across wooden walls. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax and smoke. Stories were told, prayers were said, and then, slowly, the house grew quiet. Formal schooling was not always consistent in colonial Virginia. Some children were sent away to be taught by tutors, while others learned at home from books or family instruction. George's early education was modest. He studied reading, writing, and arithmetic, but perhaps more importantly, he learned manners, discipline, and the values of honesty and perseverance. One of the small notebooks he kept as a boy still survives. In it, he carefully copied out rules of civility, a list of maxims about how to behave, how to treat others, how to speak with respect. The handwriting is neat but youthful. The rules themselves are simple, yet they shaped the quiet foundation of his character. We often imagine childhood in earlier centuries as strict and solemn, but there was laughter too. Children played games, rolling hoops, tossing balls, and running across fields. George surely laughed with his brothers, and perhaps felt the warmth of summer evenings, when fireflies drifted lazily through the grass. As George entered his teenage years, the world around him began to open up in new ways. He was no longer just a child wandering the fields near his home. He was becoming a young man, ready to step out into the wider world. In Virginia at the time, land was everything. It was the foundation of wealth, status, and family security. Land meant fields for crops, pastures for animals, and woodlands for building and hunting. And so, surveying, the careful measuring and mapping of land was an important profession. It required precision, patience, and a steady eye. George, with his quiet diligence, was drawn to it. Imagine him, still only in his mid-teens, setting out with a small group of men. They carried simple instruments, a compass, a chain for measuring distance, and notebooks for recording their findings. The air was fresh, the forests deep, and the rivers wide. Each day they would rise with the sun, their boots damp with dew, their hands steady as they marked out lines and boundaries. Surveying was not glamorous work, but it brought George close to the heart of Virginia's natural beauty. He walked through fields filled with wildflowers, across ridges where hawks soared silently overhead, and along streams where the water ran cool and clear. At night, they camped under the stars. The crackle of the campfire was their evening companion. The smell of pine smoke drifted up into the night sky. George would rest on his blanket, looking up at constellations, feeling the vastness of the world above him. This quiet profession taught him more than just measurements. It taught him patience. It taught him the value of careful work and the satisfaction of marking a line straight and true. It also introduced him to people beyond his family, farmers, landowners, and neighbors in the growing colony. He learned to listen, to speak with courtesy, and to carry himself with calm authority to better understand George in these years. It helps to picture daily life in Virginia in the 1740s. Most families lived in wooden houses, some small and simple, others larger, with brick chimneys and paneled rooms. The homes smelled of wood smoke, beeswax candles, and sometimes herbs drying near the hearth. Meals were hearty but plain. Cornbread, stews, roasted meats, and seasonal vegetables made up the diet. Apples were stored for winter, and cider was a common drink. Tea, imported from far away, was a treasured luxury. Clothing was practical, though still guided by English fashion. Men wore breeches, waistcoats, and coats of wool or linen. Women wore long gowns with aprons, their hair often covered by caps. The fabrics were sometimes coarse, but well cared for. Each item was valuable, mended and reused again and again. The rhythm of life was slow, tied to the seasons. Spring brought planting, summer brought tending, autumn brought harvest, and winter brought rest and reflection. Church services marked the weeks, and neighbors gathered to share news, to trade, and to offer one another companionship. George's world was not one of cities and bustle, but of fields, rivers, and quiet homesteads. The pace was steady. The days began with the crow of a rooster and ended with the dim light of candles. It was a world of labor, but also of deep simplicity. As George grew older, people began to notice his qualities. He was tall, strong, and carried himself with calm composure. He was not yet the commanding figure we imagine from portraits, but the foundation of that presence was there. Neighbors respected him for his honesty. When he said he would do something, he did it. When he gave his word, he kept it. And though he was young, this reliability gave him a sense of quiet authority. At the age of just 17, he received his first official appointment as a county surveyor. It was an unusual honor for someone so young, but George had proven himself. His neat handwriting, his careful maps, and his steady manner convinced others that he was suited for the role. Each assignment took him farther afield. He walked miles each day through forests and over hills. The land was wild in many places, filled with tall grasses, unfamiliar plants, and the distant sounds of unseen animals. His boots wore thin, his hands grew calloused, yet his spirit remained steady. And at night, in quiet camps, he wrote in his journal. The entries were plain, recording distances and directions, the lay of the land, the weather overhead. But within those pages, one can almost hear the voice of a young man slowly growing into himself. Family remained important in George's life. His father, Augustine, passed away when George was just 11. This loss shaped him quietly. Without a strong paternal figure, he leaned on his older half-brothers, particularly Lawrence. Lawrence Washington lived at a fine estate called Mount Vernon. It overlooked the wide Potomac River, with broad fields stretching out around it. George visited often, absorbing the atmosphere of the place. At Mount Vernon, George saw what it meant to manage land, to host guests, and to carry oneself with dignity. Lawrence had served in the military and carried a worldly air which George admired. In the evenings, George may have sat quietly, listening to conversations about trade, politics, and travel, storing away knowledge for the future. It was here, at Mount Vernon, that George's imagination began to grow. He dreamed not just of surveying land for others, but of owning and shaping his own. He pictured fields stretching to the horizon, orchards in blossom, and homes filled with family and friends. This dream of a peaceful estate would remain with him for his entire life. By his late teens, George had gained a reputation for quiet strength. He was not loud, nor did he seek attention. Instead, his presence was felt in the way he stood, in the calm way he spoke, and in the simple steadiness of his actions. Neighbors might see him riding a horse along a country lane, his posture straight, his expression calm. Or they might see him at work in the fields, measuring and marking with precision. Always steady, always reliable. Though the world was slowly moving toward greater conflicts, the tension between empires, the struggles over land, George's early years were rooted in peace. The quiet streams, the tall trees, the endless skies, these were his first teachers. And they gave him a foundation of patience, of balance, and of calm. By the time George entered his early 20s, the colonies were slowly shifting. The forests and rivers were still there, as calm and quiet as before, but the world beyond them was stirring with tension. England and France, great powers across the ocean, were watching the American colonies closely. Each wished to claim more land, more trade, more influence. For young men in Virginia, this meant opportunities for service. And George, though quiet and thoughtful, felt drawn to the life of a soldier. His older brother, Lawrence, had served with distinction, and George admired him deeply. When Lawrence fell ill and traveled to the island of Barbados in search of better health, George went with him. It was George's first and only trip outside the mainland of North America. The journey by ship was long, the sea vast and endless. Imagine George standing on deck, the salty wind tugging at his coat, the slow creak of wooden beams beneath his feet, the horizon stretching wide and mysterious. Barbados was different from Virginia. The air was heavy and warm, filled with the scent of sugarcane and sea breezes. The nights hummed with the sounds of insects, and the stars glimmered above palm trees rather than pines. George saw a world shaped by trade, by plantations, and by the rhythms of island life. During his time there, he contracted smallpox. The illness left him weak for weeks, his skin marked by scars that would stay with him all his life. Yet it also gave him something valuable: immunity. Later, when smallpox swept through armies and towns, George carried with him a quiet strength that many others lacked. After returning home, George settled once more into the rhythms of Virginia. But the thought of service, of wearing a uniform and taking on responsibility, lingered in his mind. In 1753, George was given an unusual assignment. The governor of Virginia, worried about French movements in the Ohio Valley, needed someone to carry a message warning to the French officers who had built forts there. It was a dangerous journey through wilderness and uncertain lands, and yet the governor chose George, only 21 years old, for the task. Why? Because he was known for his steadiness, his careful maps, his ability to travel through woods with patience and calm. So George set out. Imagine him moving quietly through snowy forests, a small party of men at his side. The air was sharp, the rivers cold, the nights long. They crossed icy streams, camped on the frozen ground, and pressed onward with determination. At last, he delivered the message, a formal request that the French leave the territory. They did not. But George's journey had proven something. He could be trusted with responsibility. He could endure hardship, and he could remain calm in the face of difficulty. This was the beginning of his military path. In the years that followed, he would be drawn into skirmishes, into battles, and into the wider conflict known as the French and Indian War. But in these early years, what mattered most was not the gunfire or the clash of armies. It was George's quiet growth into a man of responsibility. When George was not on military assignments, he returned to the quieter world of Virginia plantations. Here, daily life continued at a gentle rhythm. At Mount Vernon, the estate his brother Lawrence had left behind after his passing, George began to take on responsibilities. The land stretched wide, with fields of tobacco, wheat, and corn. There were orchards filled with fruit trees, pastures dotted with animals, and gardens tended with care. Each morning, the sun rose over the Potomac River, casting a golden light across the water. The air carried the fresh scent of dew on grass and the distant sound of birds beginning their songs. George would rise early, often before dawn, and begin his day. Plantation life was demanding, but also steady. There were workers to oversee, fences to mend, tools to sharpen, and crops to plan. George's attention to detail served him well. He kept records, careful, neat, and exact. He noted the weather, the yields, the conditions of soil and seed. Meals at Mount Vernon were simple but filling. Breakfast might be bread, porridge, and tea. Dinner, served in the afternoon, was the largest meal. Roasted meats, vegetables, pies, and sometimes fish from the river. Evenings brought lighter fare, perhaps bread and cheese, before the household settled into rest. Guests sometimes arrived, traveling by horse or by boat along the Potomac. Hospitality was a valued custom, and George welcomed visitors with warmth, offering them food, conversation, and a bed for the night. Though his military path was slowly unfolding, George found comfort in these rhythms: the planting of seeds, the tending of fields, the sight of the river flowing calmly by. As the 1750s moved on, conflict between Britain and France grew stronger. Battles broke out in the wilderness. Forts were built and lost, and alliances were made and broken. George played his part, commanding men, scouting terrain, and enduring long marches. But always, beneath the clash of history, his daily habits remained simple. He kept journals, noted the lay of the land, and studied maps by candlelight. At night, after long days, he rested with quiet thoughts of home, of Mount Vernon, of fields waiting for the plow, of mornings when the river glistened softly under the rising sun. His sense of duty deepened, not only duty to his superiors, but duty to the land he called home and to the people who lived upon it. It was not a loud or dramatic feeling, but a steady one, like the slow turning of the seasons. When his military service paused, George returned once more to the life of a gentleman farmer. It was here, perhaps more than anywhere, that his character truly showed itself. He loved the land. He studied new methods of farming, experimenting with crop rotation and soil improvement. He walked through his fields, observing carefully, making notes in small books he carried. He was not content to do things simply because they had always been done. He sought better ways, more efficient ways, more sustainable ways. Visitors at Mount Vernon often remarked on his presence. He was tall, over 6 feet 2, and carried himself with quiet dignity, yet his manner was calm, his voice measured, his welcome sincere. He did not seek to dazzle or impress, but to make others comfortable. Evenings at Mount Vernon were peaceful. The household gathered in the glow of candlelight. The sounds of the day faded, the clatter of tools, the calls of workers, the creak of wagons, and were replaced by the softer sounds of crickets outside and the steady ticking of a clock within. George might sit with a book in hand, reading slowly, or write letters at his desk, the scratch of quill on paper a gentle rhythm. This was a man who found balance between action and stillness, between the demands of the world and the quiet of home. By his late 20s, George Washington had already lived through much. He had walked the wilderness as a surveyor, braved illness in distant lands, carried military responsibilities on his shoulders, and tended the land at Mount Vernon. But a new chapter of his life was about to begin. In 1758, George met a widow named Martha Custis. She was warm, gracious, and wise beyond her years. She had 2 young children and a household already well established. Their meeting was quiet, but something gentle and steady passed between them. Not long after, in January of 1759, George and Martha were married. Family, friends, and neighbors came together. The winter air was crisp, the sky pale and clear, and the newlyweds began their life together. With this union, George not only gained a wife, but also a partner who would share his days, his burdens, and his joys. Martha brought with her a sense of comfort, a calm presence that balanced George's reserved nature. Together, they would shape Mount Vernon into a home that welcomed countless guests, and into a place of peace that George always longed to return to. Mount Vernon became the heart of George Washington's life. The house itself stood with quiet dignity, overlooking the Potomac River. From its broad veranda, one could gaze out at the water flowing steadily by, its surface glimmering with sunlight by day and soft moonlight by night. The estate stretched wide, with fields of wheat and corn, orchards of apples and peaches, pastures dotted with livestock, and woodlands that provided timber and game. Paths wound their way through gardens where roses and lilacs bloomed in spring, and where Martha's careful touch could be seen in neat rows of herbs and flowers. Inside the house, the rooms were orderly and calm. The walls carried the scent of wood, polish, and beeswax candles. The fireplaces glowed warmly in the winter months, while in summer the windows were opened to let in the soft breezes from the river. Guests were often welcomed. Hospitality was a central part of life, and Martha, with her warm smile and gentle presence, ensured that everyone felt at ease. Meals were prepared with care. Stews simmered slowly, filled with vegetables from the garden, fish from the river, venison from the woods, and fruits preserved from earlier harvests found their way to the table. And in the evenings, after the work of the day was done, the household would often gather quietly. Perhaps George would read by the light of a candle, his glasses perched carefully as the pages turned. Perhaps Martha would sew, her hands steady, the sound of thread slipping through fabric soft and rhythmic. The children might play, their laughter gentle and light. Though history remembers George Washington as a general and a president, he always thought of himself first as a farmer. Each morning at Mount Vernon began early. George would rise with the dawn, the faint light of morning just touching the horizon. He would step outside, breathing in the fresh air, the dew glistening on the grass, the Potomac shining softly in the distance. He oversaw the planting of crops, the rotation of fields, the building of barns and fences. He experimented with new methods, eager to improve the land rather than exhaust it. He studied the soil, observed the weather, and made careful notes. In many ways, he approached farming as he had approached surveying and soldiering, with patience, discipline, and steady curiosity. His workers moved through the fields, their tools glinting in the sunlight, their footsteps marking paths through the rows of crops. Wagons creaked as they carried harvests back toward the barns. Horses whinnied in the pastures, chickens clucked near the coops, and dogs barked softly in the yard. For George, this was not just labor, it was life itself. The land gave food, shelter, and purpose, and he found peace in its rhythms, in the slow turning of the seasons, in the certainty that each spring would bring new growth and each autumn a harvest. While George oversaw the fields and farm, Martha tended to the heart of the household. She managed servants, organized meals, cared for her children, and ensured that guests were made welcome. She also gave George companionship that was steady and kind. Her presence brought warmth to Mount Vernon. She enjoyed gardening, sewing, and hosting gatherings. She carried herself with quiet grace, her laughter soft, her manner patient. To the children her own, and later her grandchildren, she was a figure of comfort. She taught them, guided them, and provided a sense of stability in a world that was often uncertain. Together, George and Martha created a balance, his strength and steadiness, her warmth and hospitality. Theirs was not a story of great romance in the dramatic sense, but of something perhaps more enduring, a gentle partnership built on respect, trust, and care. As the day came to a close at Mount Vernon, the estate slowly settled into quiet. The sun would sink behind the trees, the sky glowing with shades of gold and rose. The air cooled, carrying the faint scent of river water and freshly cut grass. Inside, candles were lit one by one, their flames flickering gently. The family gathered for supper, sharing food and conversation. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices, the occasional laughter of children, all of it created a warm and peaceful harmony. Afterward, the household shifted into softer activities. Perhaps George would retire to his study, where maps and papers awaited his careful eye. Perhaps Martha would sit near the hearth, her sewing basket by her side. The children might read or play a quiet game. Outside, the night creatures stirred, the steady chirp of crickets, the hoot of an owl in the woods, the distant splash of a fish in the river all blended into a lullaby of the Virginia evening. And when, at last, the candles were extinguished and the house lay in darkness, Mount Vernon rested beneath a sky filled with stars, the same stars George had once gazed upon as a young surveyor in the wilderness, the same stars that would shine over him for all his years to come. By the early 1770s, the colonies were restless. Across towns and villages, in taverns and meeting halls, quiet conversations grew into debates. People spoke of taxes, of laws, of distant rulers across the sea. It was not yet open rebellion, but a kind of tension, like the low hum before a storm. At Mount Vernon, George Washington continued his daily life walking his fields, tending his crops, writing in his journals. But he also listened. He read the newspapers that arrived by post. He heard the concerns of neighbors and friends, and slowly a sense of duty began to grow within him once again. Not the hurried, fiery duty of youth, but a deeper, steadier responsibility. A recognition that he might be called to serve not just his family, not just his estate, but the colonies as a whole. When the colonies finally organized for resistance, they looked for someone who could unite them, someone steady, respected, and calm. And so, in 1775, George Washington was chosen as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. It was not a role he had sought, nor one that he accepted lightly, but he understood the weight of the moment. He accepted, as he always had, with quiet resolve. He put on a simple uniform, mounted his horse, and prepared to lead men who were not yet truly an army farmers. Tradesmen, clerks, and neighbors now gathered together with muskets in hand. The Revolutionary War is often remembered for battles, but the greater part of it was spent in camp. Days and weeks stretched on with little fighting, but with constant labor. The soldiers rose early, often before dawn. They shivered in the cold, or sweltered in the heat, depending on the season. Their tents were simple, canvas shelters that offered little against the rain or snow. Their meals were plain hardtack biscuits, salted meat, sometimes nothing more than broth or bread. Yet within this life of hardship, there were also moments of calm. Men sat together by campfires, their voices low, the flames casting gentle light on their tired faces. Some mended their clothing, their fingers working slowly in the dim glow. Others wrote letters home, the scratch of quills mixing with the soft crackle of firewood. Still others simply rested, lying back to gaze at the stars above, the same stars they had known since childhood. And there, among them, was George Washington. Washington's presence in camp was steadying. He walked among the men, speaking little but offering calm assurance. His tall figure, straight posture, and composed expression gave them confidence. He was not a man of fiery speeches, but of quiet endurance. He shared in their hardships. He knew the cold, the hunger, the uncertainty, and because he bore it with patience, so too did they. At night, Washington often retired to his tent or a modest cabin when available. There, by candlelight, he wrote letters, studied reports, and planned the days ahead. The candle burned low, the paper filled with his careful handwriting. The room silent, save for the soft scratch of his quill and the occasional sigh of wind outside. Even in the midst of war, there was a kind of stillness in these moments, a rhythm of responsibility, of quiet thought, of preparation. One of the most remembered winters was spent at Valley Forge in 1777. The cold was bitter, the snow deep. The men lacked shoes, coats, and food. Illness spread through the camp. and the nights were long and harsh. And yet, even here, there were moments of peace. The campfires glowed in the darkness, their smoke rising slowly into the frosty air. Men gathered close, warming their hands, sharing small stories of home. The sound of wood splitting, the faint ring of a hammer, the creak of wagons, these were the sounds of survival. Washington, ever steady, rode through the camp on horseback. The soldiers looked up as he passed, drawing strength simply from his calm presence. At times he dismounted, walking among them, speaking quietly, encouraging them with a few simple words. At night he returned to his quarters. The wind rattled at the wooden walls, snow drifted against the door, but inside the candlelight glowed softly. He studied reports, drafted letters, and thought not only of battles, but of supplies, of shoes, of bread, of the simple things that kept an army alive. Valley Forge was harsh, but it was also a place where patience and perseverance grew stronger. And in that quiet endurance, Washington's leadership was most deeply felt. For most soldiers, the day was not filled with battle, but with simple tasks. Drills at dawn, the stamping of boots on frozen ground, the sharp calls of officers directing the lines, breakfast, often little more than bread and broth, taken quickly. Then hours of chopping wood, hauling water, mending clothes, and practicing with muskets. The afternoons brought more drills, or the building of huts, or long watches posted along the edges of camp. The evenings brought firelight, small gatherings, and sometimes songs softly sung, drifting out into the night. And above it all, the presence of their general, calm, measured, unwavering. Washington was not always with them in body, but always in spirit. He represented not just command, but constancy. Through the long years of the Revolution, Washington carried a weight few could imagine. Not just the weight of strategy or the outcome of battles, but the weight of hope. An entire people looked to him not for fiery words, but for quiet assurance that they could endure. And so he rose each morning, faced the day with composure, and gave what strength he could. It was not dramatic. It was steady, measured, and calm, like the flow of the Potomac, constant and sure. When the war finally turned toward victory, Washington did not celebrate with loud triumph. Instead, he thought of returning home, of Mount Vernon, of Martha, of the simple rhythms of farm and family. When the long years of the Revolution came to an end, George Washington did something remarkable. He set aside power. He resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon. The war was over, and though many saw him as a hero, he longed for nothing more than the quiet life of a farmer once again. Imagine his return. The road leading to Mount Vernon stretched before him, lined with familiar trees. The Potomac glimmered in the distance. And as he arrived, the house stood as it always had, its windows reflecting the soft light of the afternoon sun. Inside, Martha waited, her presence steady and warm, the household once again filled with the sounds of daily life, the clatter of dishes, the creak of floorboards, the gentle laughter of children and grandchildren. For a time, the world outside seemed far away, and Mount Vernon returned to its peaceful rhythms. Back on his estate, Washington returned eagerly to the work of farming. He walked the fields, studied the soil, and experimented with new crops. He shifted his focus from tobacco to wheat, from monoculture to rotation, always seeking to improve the land. Each morning, he rose early, as he always had. The sun broke gently over the river, casting light across the fields. He mounted his horse and rode the estate, observing workers, inspecting fences, and checking on livestock. At midday, he returned for a meal: bread, meats, fresh vegetables when in season. In the afternoons, he often wrote letters or reviewed accounts. In the evenings, the family gathered for supper, and then for quiet hours of reading, sewing, and gentle conversation. For Washington, these were the happiest of days, filled not with commands or armies, but with the steady turning of seasons, the dependable rhythm of farm and family. But peace, for George Washington, never lasted long. The new nation he had helped win was fragile, uncertain, and in need of guidance. And so, once again, he was called to serve. In 1789, he was unanimously chosen as the first president of the United States. He had not sought the role, but he accepted it with the same quiet sense of duty that had guided him all his life. And so, he left Mount Vernon once more, this time not for war, but for governance. The presidency was not what it would later become. There were no grand institutions, no sprawling bureaucracies. The capital itself was still unsettled, first New York, then Philadelphia. Washington's daily life as president was surprisingly simple. He rose early, as he always had, often before the sun. He dressed with care, his uniform replaced now by plain but dignified clothing. He ate breakfast, quietly tea, bread, perhaps some fish or cold meat. The mornings were filled with correspondence. He wrote letters, reviewed reports, and met with advisors. His handwriting remained neat and deliberate, his words carefully chosen. In the afternoons, he received visitors, diplomats, congressmen, ordinary citizens, sought his time. He greeted them with calm courtesy, listening more than he spoke, his presence dignified yet gentle. Evenings were often reserved for dinners. Martha played a central role here, welcoming guests with warmth, ensuring that the table was set with care. The meals were not lavish, but they were plentiful and thoughtful. Soups, roasts, vegetables, and puddings, often accompanied by wine or cider. Conversation was steady, never rushed, always respectful. And when the house finally grew quiet, Washington retired to read, to reflect, and to prepare for the day ahead. The presidency carried immense weight. Every decision set a precedent. Every action shaped the future. And yet, Washington carried this burden, as he had always carried burdens, calmly, steadily, without seeking attention. He thought often of home, of Mount Vernon, of the simple rhythms he missed. But he gave his time to the nation, knowing that the foundation being laid would outlast him. For 8 years he served, through uncertainty, through disagreements, through the challenges of a young country finding its way. His presence gave stability. And when at last he stepped down, he did so willingly, returning once again to the peace of Mount Vernon. The last years of George Washington's life were spent where he most wished to be, at Mount Vernon. He returned to the life of a farmer, rising with the sun, walking his fields, and caring for the estate. He welcomed visitors often, for many wished to see him, to speak with the man who had led a revolution and guided a new nation. He received them with courtesy, offering them food, conversation, and a glimpse of his simple, steady life. But most of all, he savored the quiet moments, sitting on the veranda, watching the river flow, walking through the gardens with Martha, listening to the soft sounds of the household as evening settled in the distant call of birds, the rustle of trees, the steady ticking of a clock in the hall. In December of 1799, after a brief illness, George Washington passed away at Mount Vernon. He was 67 years old. His final days were not filled with drama, but with calm acceptance. He remained composed, steady, and thoughtful, as he had been all his life. And when he left this world, it was in the place he loved most, surrounded by the land and the family that had always anchored him. George Washington is remembered in statues, in portraits, in history books, filled with grand events. But perhaps the truest memory of him lies in the quiet details. The boy exploring fields in Virginia, the young surveyor walking through forests, measuring with care, the farmer rising with the dawn, noting the soil and the seasons, the general riding through camp, his presence steady among weary soldiers, the president writing letters by candlelight, his hand calm, his words deliberate, and the man at Mount Vernon sitting peacefully on his veranda, watching the river flow by. His life was filled with duty, but also with simple rhythms, and it is in those rhythms that we can find peace. And now, as this story draws to a close, let your own eyes grow heavy. Let your breath slow, steady as the Potomac's flow. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. Like Washington, you can rest, knowing that the day is complete and that tomorrow will come gently in its own time. The candle burns low, the house grows still, and you too may drift softly into sleep. Good night.